I really appreciate you joining us here on Washington Times Higher Ground. You have been sharing your story, and it is a very harrowing and difficult story of what your family went through during the Holocaust. Take us through your childhood. What is your earliest memory of what was happening with Hitler and the Nazis and how it impacted your family?
Well, the earliest that I remember of Hitler's time would be in the mid 30s or maybe upper 30s. I was born in 32, so
Yeah. And how old were you when your family and when you and your brother started to be impacted by what the Nazis were doing?
well, whatever they were doing, um, our parents and our grandparents talked about it. So Peter and I listened, and we were always pretty much advised as to what was going on.
Yeah, and it came to a point where your parents had to make a tough decision to try to protect you guys, and they sent you to go and live with your grandparents. Talk a little bit about that experience and what you were feeling at the time. I know you were pretty young.
Yeah, we were actually living in Austria, in Vienna, and my father was working for Schuschnigg for the government of Austria, and he knew that Hitler was going to come into Austria for the Anschluss, as we call it in German, where he took over Austria and made it part of Germany. So he wanted to make sure that we would not be there when that happened. So he sent us to Berlin uh, to live with my grandparents.
And as children, how much did you understand, at that time? Because you start at that point when you moved to Berlin, you started going to a school. And actually, before we even get there, let's talk about the fact that your parents, you had an interesting family dynamic. One of your parents was Jewish and
Yeah.
one was Catholic. So talk a little bit about that dynamic and how it helped you navigate some of this.
Well, what helped us tremendously, of course, my father, who was Catholic, was excommunicated from the Catholic Church because he married a Jewish woman. But um, otherwise, what they did when they sent us to Berlin, the first thing my parents did is they took us to a Catholic church and had us baptized, so that our papers, people would ask us, everything would say Catholic rather than Jewish. And that was a big help, a tremendous help to us. It really helped us.
It helped you ensure that you weren't sent away because you could at that point say we're Catholic, right? You could sort of blend in better, right?
Exactly. And we didn't have to wear the star, whereas my grandparents and my parents always had to wear the yellow star when they would be out of the house. And Peter and I didn't because we were Catholic.
So
Just
talk a
baptized.
just baptized you were baptized Catholic and that helped you sort of navigate that. Um, Take us through. So you're living with your grandparents. At what point did you really understand that people's lives were at stake, that what Hitler was doing was diabolical and deadly and hurting people? When did you first realize that?
Probably when I was about 37.
Not 37, 1937.
Born in 32, so I was 5 years old at that point.
So you were pretty young. You were pretty young realizing that. And I know in school, talk a little bit about the school experience because as you were going in as a Catholic, Hitler Youth, some of these experiences, talk about what you went through and what you faced and what you had to do in order to blend in.
Yeah, when I started school in Berlin, I was 6 years old, and when we would come after class out, we could not play or run home or anything like this. We had to stay at the school for a while. We had to be in stand-in formation. We had to learn the Hitler salute, and we learned how to march. A couple years later from that, we actually were already trained to throw grenades and to shoot a bazooka.
What was it like to have to say those things and do those things knowing who you were, who your mother was, who your grandparents were? How difficult was that for you and your
It was
brother?
very, very difficult, but my brother and I, we kind of talked about it all the time, and we kept each other moving and going, and we both knew what it was. If I had any doubts, I would talk to my brother and vice versa. So we stuck together, and my parents and grandparents encouraged that because they knew what we were going through, especially in school. So it worked.
Now, this part of your story is incredibly heartbreaking and it's difficult. And I just want to emphasize right now, you joining us for this, we truly appreciate it because this is not easy to talk about. You know, it's not easy to remember these things, to go back through them, but we don't want people to forget what happened to millions of people, and a lot of people have forgotten that message. And I just want to emphasize that before I ask the next question, because it is very difficult what happened to your parents. Let's talk first about your mother. She ended up getting arrested and she ended up losing her life in a concentration camp. Can you talk about her story and what happened to her?
Yeah. My mother, when the Nazi business got worse in Berlin, she went into exile. She went to Czechoslovakia and lived in Prague. She lived there until Hitler took over Czechoslovakia, and now was after all the Jews in the Czechoslovakia area. So my mother then somehow got out of Czechoslovakia and came back to Berlin. Even though it sounds strange that Berlin would be the place to be because that's the capital and that's where Hitler eventually had his offices. But for some reason or another, that was really, there were so many people of every belief and so on. And Berlin was actually safer at that point, somewhat safer, let's say. My my parents had to and grandparents had to make that judgment, you know.
Yeah. And what led to your mother's arrest? When you and I previously spoke, there were so many elements to her story that broke my heart. One of them being your final conversation with her in jail. But what was it that led to her arrest?
Well, somehow my father by then was already in the concentration camp, the same one where Chushnik were. They were taken there, Sachsenhausen, right north of Berlin. And somehow my father and my mother continued to communicate uh, through an SS officer who was being paid for his services to us. It was very illegal for him, and I'm sure he was caught. But what happened is one morning, my mother told both of us, "Here is an envelope. I want you to get on the subway, ride from here to such a station, and as you come out of the steps, out onto the street, there will be a gentleman, and he will walk up to you, and he has a code word." And we knew the code word. My mother told us that. And We gave him a large envelope from my mother, and in return, he gave us an envelope for my mother, from evidently my father. We then went back on the subway, uh, went back to our subway station, which is right around the corner from where my mother lived with us. And as we came around the corner to go home, we saw all kind of Gestapo and SS vehicles, automobiles, in front of the large apartment house where we lived at that time. So we thought it would be better for us not to go there if we stayed on the corner, peeking around the corner to see what was going on, hoping we could go home soon and ask our mother what was going on in the building. And so we watched, and all of a sudden we saw some SS people take my mother and put her in one of the cars, and all the cars left. So that's how that part went. And then we went home, and my mother told us that whenever anything like this would happen, she had an attorney friend and we had the phone number, and you call him and tell him what happened. And of course, we did that.
What when you saw your mother being taken into that police car, what went through your heart and your mind in that moment?
It was a deadly feeling. Absolutely a deadly feeling, because we knew what happened to people who were being arrested by the SS and by the Gestapo at that point. At that point,
And
we were a little older. We were 10 years old after my mother had come back. So we understood from Czechoslovakia. So we knew a little bit more, you know?
you understood. You understood. And I know that you, over the course of a few days, were able to locate what jail she was in. And you and your brother then went to that jail. Talk a little bit about that experience and your conversation with her. And I want people to understand this was the last time that you saw your mother.
Yes, that's correct. It took us 2 or 3 days before we found out which prison my mother was taken to. And Peter and I, we said, we're going to go to that prison. We're going to see our mother. And we went there. And we walked right into the prison, and walked up to some big windows, and we saw people down below walking. And we looked, and all of a sudden, we realized that we thought we recognized our mother as one of the people walking down there in a circle in this inside the prison. It was outside, but the prison was built so that they could walk outside and still be by four walls. Um, so we looked at them for a while, and then we saw that they were all taken in, the people who walked there. So now we decided that we had to find out what cell she was in. And we did. And we walked from floor to floor. And for some reason or another, we saw a lot of police, a lot of SS rather, and officers. And no one paid any attention to us because we were just kids walking around. And we found, luckily, the cell where my mother was. And yeah, Mom, hi. What's happening then? When are you coming home? And she said, Boys, I don't know if I'm coming home very soon. Be good. Make your phone call that I told you about. And be good at school. Always learn well. Do your arithmetic. Do all of that. And she said, You better leave right now because if they catch you here, you're not going to leave.
Wow.
So we listened to her. We left, and before we got to the final gate, some guard all of a sudden realized that we were running around the prison, and they grabbed us and held us. One guy, and my brother and I, we were able to shake him off, get loose from him, ran out of the front door of the prison into the streets, and he was after us, but he couldn't run as fast as we could. So after a couple of blocks, we had totally lost him. Um,
Wow. Wow.
that was the last time we saw our mother.
There's so much loss in this, and I look at your story, and for anybody who is watching this or listening to this right now, you have a book, My Two Lives, that you tell your story in this book, and I would encourage people to get that book so they can read all the details of your story of really so much success in your life, moving after all of this happened. But before we get there, you lost your mother, you lost your father. What was the full effect of this on your family? How did you move forward after all of this? Because it seems so unimaginably difficult.
It was. It was. Through this attorney of mine, he contacted my grandfather, and my grandfather, I guess he planned that there were going to be problems, that he needed to get us out of the city. And he told us to get on a train and go to a place in northern Germany. It was a camp for boys and girls, a small camp. And we took the train, and we went to a place called Dangast, which is right on the North Sea, right on the beach. Beautiful place. And that's where the camp was. The camp was run by a lady. Her name was Irma Franzen Heinrichsdorf. Irma eventually became my second mother. My grandfather's idea was that until the problems were over, that we could stay there for a couple of months. And of course, he was paying this lady for our stay there. And this lady knew who we were. She knew she knew that we were had a Jewish mother, and that's the reason why we were there. And she said, "Yeah, I just mix them in with all the other kids, and we'll be all right."
So she
And
risked her life then too. She risked her life, I would assume, concealing you and your brother.
absolutely, completely. And she had two children of her own, a boy and a
Wow.
girl, who at that time were still living at home, and they were a little bit older than we were, 6, 8 years older. And yeah, it was very dangerous for her. Now, her children went to the Hitler Youth. They were members of the Hitler Youth. And Tante Irma said to us, join the Hitler Youth. That'll be the best way for you to hide, because if you stay here and you don't go to the Hitler Youth, people are going to notice that, and they're going to say, who are these boys? Because everybody had to be in the Hitler Youth. It was mandatory for anyone who was not Jewish or whatever. So
And
we
for those
told,
who don't know, because you and your brother had to, what is or what was the Hitler Youth?
well, the Hitler Youth was an organization that Hitler started. It was similar to really the American Boy Scouts, except we learned a little bit more about how to be soldiers, how to fight, and how to use weapons. And we did that. We continuously did that. Otherwise, the Hitler Youth, we had to learn all about Hitler's philosophy in school. We, when we would go to school in the morning, we had to sing songs about the danger of the Jews and why the Jews should be shipped away and were being shipped away to work elsewhere. And of course, my brother and I, we knew what was going on, but we decided, yeah, we wanted to live. We were going to take that advice. So we joined the Hitler Youth, which was no problem with our Catholic papers at that time, even though the Hitler people didn't like the Catholics either. And I think by the end of the war, there was something like 2,000 or 2,400 priests, Catholic priests, who ended up in concentration camps. But anyway, at that time, we joined the Hitler Youth and we went to school. After school, we all had to go to work because all the men were in the army, were in the service somewhere. So the only people left were the women, older men, and the children.
How old were you? And maybe it was right away, but when you learned about your mother and father's death and the loss of family members, how did you find that out and how old were you?
Well, yeah, we were about 11 years or so old, and we didn't hear about it until Tante Irma, the lady who ran the camp, told us about it on Christmas Day.
On Christmas Day.
Yes.
Wow.
Now,
How did you process that? How did you deal with that? That's such a heavy thing for a child to hear.
I guess I cried a lot at that moment, but before you knew, the time was there to go back to the Hitler Youth meetings, and we continued doing that. By the way, the reason she knew that our mother was killed was from our teacher. Our teacher belonged to the SS, and we saw him every day. He taught me for something like 7 or 8 years. He belonged to the SS, but he was a friend, a very good friend of Tante Irma. And for some reason, somehow, he knew that our mother was Jewish and why we were there. And he and Tante Irma together always kept us safe because many times the Gestapo or someone else would come to the house and challenge Tante Irma to tell them, where did these boys come from? Who are they? And she said, well, they were sent here to get healthy and to live here and to go to school here. And somehow she always talked them, the Gestapo, out of it, and somehow they would leave. But the big help was our teacher. I mean, this is a strange story. He knew who we were, and he was a very good friend of Tante Irma. And
Wow.
when school was finished at 1 o'clock, we would see him change. He all of a sudden came down to had changed into his black SS uniform, got on his motorcycle, and went to the next SSS meetings or whatever the SS did there. I don't really know. I don't know where he went. But when Tante Irma needed him, he was somehow always there for her. And
Wow.
they would meet secretly or whatever.
Can I ask you a question? How did you embrace any form of forgiveness? A lot of people after what you went through would have so much anger and hatred because of the amount of loss and evil. How did you move past that?
Yeah, well, it really took coming to the America. When I was 17 years old, through the U.S. Army in Germany, they brought us to the United States. Um, it was called the United States Committee for Care of European Children. Uh, they were financed half by Jewish people, half by Catholic people. And when we finally got to the United States, we had no papers because they shipped us out within a matter of 3 or 4 weeks after they told us that we could come to America. It went very quickly, and they flew us to New York. And in New York, in the Bronx, they had there was a big building, uh, and it was quite occupied by children who the United States Committee for the Care of European Children brought there, and we would stay there until either we the little ones, the younger ones, were adopted by American families, and the older ones, like my brother and myself, they told us that once we get your papers, you can go anywhere you want to go in America and make your own life, which
Wow.
is exactly what we wanted, you know?
Yeah, a fresh start to be able to move forward, and you did that beautifully. And again, your book, My Two Lives, it talks all about the successful business you built, the family you built, and you were able to move forward in your life after such a horrible thing. But I have to ask you one other big thing here because right now, as we're talking about this, just months ago, a horrific attack on Israel by Hamas, anti Semitism rising around the world. You have polls that show young people, big proportions, 20% of young people saying the Holocaust is a myth. When you see all of these things as a Holocaust survivor, what goes through your heart and your mind?
Yeah, it's very sad. I don't understand why they're not better educated through the schools in this country because this is history after all. And what history is more important? Who else killed 6 or 7 million people within a matter of 2 or 3 years, as Hitler did? And coming to the United States, I was surprised that so many people did not know more about it. But at that point, we had to, first of all, think uh, what we were going to do. We certainly didn't want to get into any sort of arguments or trouble over there. So I stayed there for the first 3 years that I was in Germany. The first year I worked in a necktie factory. They were making neckties. And the next 2 years, I was going to school constantly. Uh, and after I had been there 1 year in the United States, I got my first job in the insurance business. It was a small company, but I knew enough English by then that I could get a job in an office, and I did. 2 years after that, I was drafted by the United States government during the Korean War. And I went to basic training with the 101st Airborne out in
Wow.
Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky. And after the basic training was finished, they called me in and they said, "Listen, we see on your Form 20. Your Form 20 is your whole life is on that form that the Army has for you." They said, "You speak German fluently, and we would like you to, rather than going to Korea, we want you to go to Germany and become an interpreter for the American Army." So
Wow.
I was very, very lucky because many of my friends who were in basic training, boys that we trained together, never came back from Korea. So I went to Germany and as an interpreter, and actually it was a very interesting period for me because we were the Americans at that time were already training the German army again. They called it Volkspolizei. It was no Polizei. Polizei means police, a people's police. It was we were training them to be a regular army because a few miles to the east the Russians were, and we didn't have a very good relationship, the Americans as well as you know other countries, with the Russians at that time. So
You know,
yeah, it's,
I hear you telling this part of your story, and it's sort of crazy to me that you would end up back right at Germany in that context. But it's so interesting starting this new life. You've written on this, and you brought up a great point about educating people. People need to be educated about this, which is why stories like yours need to be told, especially with so much anti-Semitism and hatred unfolding around the world right now. Your book is My Two Lives. And just as we round out to a close here, you wrote this book because you wanted to give a record to your family of
exactly.
what you went through. But what can people take away from it outside of your family as well? Why is it a powerful book for people to read?
Well, I wrote the book for my family, and of course, I lost my entire family. Uh, my brother and I, we were the only ones left. My father was still in a concentration camp. My mother was dead. My grandparents were dead. My uncles were dead. My aunts were dead. My nephews were dead. Everybody was dead. Everybody was killed. They all were taken to concentration camps and killed. So, uh, you know, talking about anti Semitism, ever since I was old enough to understand that Hitler was no good and what they were doing to the Jews, I kept asking people, what is anti-Semitism? I know the word of anti-Semitism, but I never understood. What is it about the Jews that the Jews are so bad that they all have to be killed? And no one ever gave me a proper answer. No one. And to this day, I still wonder why. Because I think the Jewish people are fine people. They're working people. They put a lot of emphasis on education. uh, a lot of them, that a lot of Jews that I know, and even in the United States, a lot of my customers later on were Jewish people, business people, and they worked very hard, and a lot of them are very successful, very successful.
Yeah. Well, I think it's that same face of evil that we saw with Hitler that is riling people up again today. We're watching this happen again where people are targeting the Jewish people around the world. In Israel, what happened on October 7th. And I'm just so appreciative to you and to your book, My Two Lives, and to your time today. You gave us a lot of time telling your story and sharing with us what you went through. Again, I have to emphasize that is not an easy thing to do. And we just appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you, and I was very happy to be here with you because even though my book was not written to be publicized, it was just strictly written for my family so they would know, and the children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, that we would always know where our family came from and what they went through and how they came to the United States. Um, and all of a sudden, I guess the publisher let the book go. It became known by the public, by certain people. And uh, now I'm really happy that it did because hoping that a lot of people will read the book, and especially younger people, and will learn a little bit about what this is all about. What
Absolutely.
anti-Semitism is all about, and what's happening right now in Israel with Hamas. That's a terrible thing. The way they
No,
came out
it's
and killed 1,700 Jews, the way they did it in front of their children and the children in front of their parents, and just horrible, horrible ways of doing it, you know? And yeah, that's so I'm happy that I wrote my book, even though it was written for entirely different purposes. I'm glad that it is now available. I'm glad that you are talking about it, and hopefully people will read it, more and more people, and hopefully if I can just change the mind of a few people, a handful of people, I think the book was worth all the trouble to write the book, to educate
absolutely.
people.
Absolutely. Change hearts and change minds and educate people about what happens when evil is allowed to manifest and grow. And, we're watching it happen again. And I think the question is, are we going to stand up to it and stop it and educate people enough so they know that this is wrong? I really appreciate you taking the time and joining us again. The book is My Two Lives. Thank you so much.
Bill, thank you very much for having me and talking about my book.